Welcome to Future Histories. My name is Jan Groß, and it is my great pleasure to welcome Andreas Malm in today's episode. He's a professor of human ecology at Lund University and a prominent academic as well as activist voice in the fight against climate change and fossil capital. We talk about a new book Andreas has co-authored together with Wim Carton titled Overshoot: How the World Surrendered to Climate Breakdown, published by Verso, who, by the way, are in trouble as a publishing house through no fault of their own and need your support. So I'll put a link to their support page in the show notes. Please visit it, and if you can, then support Verso. Thanks. So Andreas and we talk about his recently released book Overshoot, but we also dig a little bit deeper into this project as a whole, because Overshoot is only the first part of a two-part project by Andreas and Wim. I had the pleasure of reading an early version of the follow-up book to Overshoot, which engages closely with three different options the authors see on the horizon, namely adaptation, carbon dioxide removal, and geoengineering. More on it in the interview itself, but maybe as a teaser, the second installment of their two-book inquiry will be called The Long Heat: Climate Politics When It's Too Late, and is about to be released 1 year after Overshoot, so about late 2025, I guess. This episode came about in the context of a conference organized by NYU's Remarque Institute titled Europe and the Planet: The Day After Tomorrow: Social and Democratic Responses to the Climate Crisis. I am currently a fellow at the Remarque Institute here in New York, and Andreas spoke at one of the conference's panels. And I want to use this opportunity to give a shout out to the Remarque Institute, of course, the other fellows at the Institute, as well as the permanent staff, Amy Nguyen, Samantha Paul, and of course, Stefanos Gerolanos, the director of the Remarque Institute. Also, a big shout out to Jonas Knatz. I have to say, I really enjoy my time here, so thanks for everything. And before we start, I want to make a quick announcement. I created a research platform dedicated to the study of democratic planning. It serves as a shared resource that unites essential tools and materials for in-depth exploration of the past, present, and future of democratic planning. It includes a collaboratively run database, syllabi of essential readings, a forum, and more. And I will present the platform at an event of the International Network for Democratic Economic Planning, or INDEP in short. And I'll put a link in the show notes for this event as well. So if you're interested in research on democratic planning, then please join in. And now, enjoy today's episode with Andreas Malm on Overshoot. Welcome, Andreas.
Thank you so much, John.
Thank you for being here. Andreas, Overshoot has been published very recently on October 1st, I think, 3 days ago to be precise. But there's also a second part to this project, a second book, which will be released 1 year later, or about a year later, under the title The Long Heat: Climate Politics When It's Too Late. Before we dig deeper into the specific content, could you give us an overview of the project as a whole? What was it you wanted to accomplish with these books?
Yeah, so it is, I guess, fundamentally rooted in our interest in carbon dioxide removal. So the technologies for drawing CO2 out of the atmosphere, their potentials and their limits. But the project took on a much larger scale because we wanted to grapple with the quite big question of what do we do, what can be done once we have transgressed these boundaries for global warming that shouldn't be transgressed. So 1.5 degrees of global warming, now in the process of being transgressed, and next in line 2 degrees. And of course, this can continue. So we are, well, the first book is basically an attempt to answer the question, how did we end up here in this moment, or, historical conjuncture where these limits are exceeded? Just a short time after the world committed itself to make sure that they would never be exceeded. So the first book is like about the drivers propelling us beyond these limits. The second book, which is a much, much larger study, then looks into what can be done to uh, to manage the fallout from this disastrous failure of respecting these limits. And the three things that can be done essentially are adaptation, so trying to live with the effects of unmitigated global warming at the best of people's abilities. The second is carbon dioxide removal, and this is the main focus in the second volume. So taking out the excess CO2 from the atmosphere by one technology or another. And the third thing that you can do is solar geoengineering, so blocking incoming sunlight in some way. And yeah, we tried to approach these things open-minded in the sense that we don't want to, come from a position where we say that all of these things are inherently bad. Mm, uh, because it's undeniably a fact that it's extremely late and the situation is very dire. And there is too much CO2 in the atmosphere already. So we need to be entirely open to the idea of taking CO2 out from the atmosphere, for instance. This seems by definition necessary. It's just that the various technologies for doing so, and all of these technologies for managing overshoot come to be deployed in such a way that they rather make the problem worse than better because they're on the ground, they're used to prolong business as usual. The typical case would be an oil company that flaunts some technology for drawing down CO2 as a justification for just keeping pumping oil. Yeah. I mean, this is a sprawling work. It's big and messy, but this is kind of the entry point into the field. Yeah.
Right. And the first book, I mean, it's titled Overshoot, and it looks not only at the fact that 1.5 is being transgressed, but Overshoot also stands for a certain type of ideological politics that is attached to this notion of overshoot. Could you describe this ideological politics and why it's important to understand the reasoning behind this type of ideology, so to speak?
Yeah, so overshoot is a term with a few different related meanings in the book and in the science more generally. One, which is perhaps the most narrow definition in climate science, is the idea that we can actually go beyond 1.5 degrees. And then later in the 21st century, we can roll out negative emissions technologies that will take us back to 1.5. We refer to this sometimes as overshoot and return or programmatic overshoot. So this is an idea that has been developed as a kind of a programmatic, explicit way of doing the best possible climate politics, namely to miss the target but hit it later. And this has become absolutely central to climate policy making and a lot of science in the past 2 decades. Then, in a slightly broader sense, I think we use the term overshoot to name or designate a particular historical moment or conjuncture, which is the one that we seem to be living in now, where dominant classes have essentially given up on mitigation and just, thrown their hands up and accepted that uh, fossil fuel extraction is continuing and expanding, and more capital is being invested in it. And dominant classes are going along with this. I mean, they are the ones doing it, and they don't have any real project uh, for for stopping this. Rather, their project is to continue doing it. But they have to do then something else to manage the mess over which they are presiding. And therefore, the overshoot conjuncture inspires all these searches for what can we do instead. So, so we haven't been able to cut emissions, and there's nothing on the agenda suggesting that we're actually going to do so soon. So what are we going to do? We have to do something else. And then there is this endless creativity, this production of ideas for what you can do instead. Everything uh, from crazy solar geoengineering, astrophysicist approaches like some semi weird scientists propose that we could attach the sun to an asteroid to nudge it out of orbit to get a little bit farther away from the sun, so we cool the Earth down that way. Or scientists proposing that we can accelerate photosynthesis in the Amazon and thereby draw down more CO2 by hanging light bulbs on top of the canopy so that the trees are soaked in artificial light even during the night, keeping photosynthesis on during the night and thereby increasing the rate of carbon sequestration in the rainforest. So we're in this moment where you have this frantic search for substitutes for the mitigation that didn't happen. And this is partly still at the level of just science, so various ideas, but it's also a matter of experiments and real initiatives, not the least on the solar geoengineering front, where you've seen a real spurt in experiments recently. But of course, also the negative emissions technologies field that is just burgeoning, this very rapidly developing all kinds of ideas for how to deal with this.
And within Overshoot, within the book Overshoot, you quite closely engage with the question. I mean, the subtitle of the book is How the World Surrendered to Climate Breakdown. And you quite closely engage with this question also on a level, I would say, of political economy of green technology. So you quite specifically look at reasons why this mitigation didn't happen, why the massive transfer into green technologies didn't happen. And a very important element you point out is the question of profitability. Both profitability and attached to it the question of asset stranding. So you look quite closely at reasons why this project didn't happen within capitalism and capitalist relations, and why you argue it can't happen within capitalism. Could you point us to these very important aspects of profitability and attached to it the question of asset stranding?
Yeah, I mean, this would perhaps have, until quite recently, come across as an obscure Marxist explanation for the missing transition. But thanks largely to the work of Brett Christophers and its reception in mainstream bourgeois media, Financial Times, and Economist, and so on, it's now becoming a fairly widely accepted theory, although obviously there's no consensus about it. The theory being, the explanation being that renewable energy doesn't generate anything like the profits that fossil fuels do. And therefore, the people who have a lot of capital at their disposal and make decisions about where to invest it will put their money in continuous investment in fossil fuels. This goes for most obviously the big fossil fuel companies, who some of them have ventured into tiny portfolio of renewable energy projects, most famously BP. But because the profit differential is so extreme, and the profits that they make from oil and gas is orders of magnitude larger than the profits that they can squeeze out of their renewable energy projects, they tend to scupper these projects and kill them. And this is what BP did after the profit bonanza of 2022. This is what Shell did as well, and go for all-out continuous investment in fossil fuels. But it's the same for banks and asset manager firms and other institutions in the circuit of financial capital, when they decide, okay, where are we going to invest our money? Are we going to put it in these renewable energy projects that in the best case yield maybe 3 or 4% profit? And that's in the best case. Very often they yield none. Or are we going to put it in the latest batch of fossil fuel infrastructure expansion where we can expect a profit of 10 or 20 or 30%? And naturally, because this is a capitalist system, they will then put their money in the more profitable category, which means that we're seeing this endless expansion of fossil fuel projects around the world, spearheaded by the US, which is the country producing most oil and gas in the world. No country has ever produced as much of it as the US does now. And the US is leading the charge to just open up more and more fields and infrastructure. But countries like Australia, Canada, the UK, Norway are not far behind in terms of their aggressive pursuit of this expansion. And I think that the situation in the world right now, well, who knows what's going to play out in the next couple of days and weeks in the Middle East, but there is a risk, and only, merely the fact that there is a risk of what some refer to as an energy war, with strikes on Iranian oil facilities and then counter strikes on American and US allied oil assets in the Persian Gulf region. Uh, if that were to happen, obviously it would mean an even more massive increase in the price of oil and gas than what we saw in the wake of the invasion of Ukraine in 2022. And as much as that might create strains on the world economy, it's bound to increase even more the profits of oil and gas companies, because when prices skyrocket because of some disturbance to oil supplies, these companies really have a golden opportunity to cash in on their investment in productive locations and efficient technology that allow them to produce oil and gas below the average price. And if they have positioned themselves on the market in that way, and this is what ExxonMobil and Saudi Aramco, of course, and other oil giants have been doing successfully for the past years, then a sudden price spike because of a disruption like a major war will mean that they drown in money and use that money to invest even more in fossil fuels, and they will attract even more interest from banks and asset managers. This is what we saw in the wake of the war in Ukraine. And there's nothing commensurate in the renewable energy sector, because solar and wind are not vulnerable to the shocks of war, fundamentally because you don't have a situation where uh, tons of sunlight captured in tanks is ferried around the world, or barrels of wind being sold through world trade. It doesn't work that way. These are not commodifiable fuels that can be transported around the world the way fossil fuels are, which means that you don't have a world market that is sensitive to the kind of shocks that you have on the oil market when there is a war involving major oil producers. So these moments of huge profit bonanza are completely absent in the renewable energy sector, which is fundamentally a good thing, because it means that renewable energy wouldn't be as volatile in its price swings as oil and gas. And also, I mean, at the root of it is, of course, the fact that sun and wind come for free. You don't need any work, you don't need any human labor, and you don't need any investment in fixed capital to generate these fuels as such, because they just come from solar energy striking the planet of the Earth. So I think we're likely to see an even more grotesque anti-transition, if you see what I mean, in the next months and years, if things are running even more out of control in the Middle East than they already are, which seems likely. Yeah, I mean, this is just one aspect of it, but it really is becoming clear, and it's becoming clearer and clearer because renewable energy is nowadays a very mature category of technologies that you can use to replace almost everything that is done through the burning of fossil fuels. And the prices of solar and wind have fallen precipitously over the past years and decades, which means that technologically, strictly speaking, humanity is in a better position than ever before to switch to a 100% renewable energy economy. The problem is that there would be very little profit in such an economy compared to the economy we have today, where fossil fuels keep yielding sensational amounts of profit.
I have a couple of follow-up questions, or at least let's start with one follow-up question, because what I do not really understand about this argument is that you rightly point out that renewable energy would not be vulnerable to these geopolitical turmoils. It would basically create a form of, or it would have the promise of creating a energy sovereignty in a very positive sense. And therefore, it would allow, in this case, nation states maybe to be independent from fossil fuel and independent from these geopolitical conflicts in relation to the question of energy. And this should be something that nation states are very much interested in. And we have other sectors of the economy. We have the agri industry, where the EU is heavily subsidizing farmers over a long period of time, because they have a more or less existential interest in maintaining a certain type of independence from the international markets. And that's why they pour like huge amounts of money into maintaining certain types of basic infrastructures, or in this case, farming within the EU. So why wouldn't states be interested in making these green technologies profitable for the capitalist actors, so that at the end, both the capitalists themselves would have the profit they are seeking, and the states would have a form of infrastructural security that they should be very much interested in, given, I mean, generally, but also given the geopolitical state of the present. So this I don't quite understand. And so it seems to be much more of a question of power, where those who already invested, that's why I also kind of brought up this question of asset stranding. It seems to me as if it's much more a question of power, where the actors who already have invested their capital into fossil capital, that they very much are interested in not pursuing this transition, but to me, actually, it seems as if the nation-state actors should have an interest in doing so.
I think you're right. If states and governments are rational actors, they would behave differently. They would not continue participating in this fossil fuel frenzy that we're seeing. And yeah, there are no neutral technical determinants of this development. And you're right, the interests in continuing with business as usual are deeply entrenched. It's a matter of path dependency, and it's a matter of a lot of capital that has been accumulated in these sectors for decades, if not centuries, that forms like an enormous just mass of inertia and recalcitrant obstruction to against the transition. And yeah, virtually every country, I mean, the US clearly would have some kind of a rational self-interest just for self-preservation as a country with various types of ecosystems in it to start mitigation and to cut emissions and to shut down the fossil fuel industry as quickly as possible. I mean, most rational would be to do it overnight, to just criminalize all oil and gas production in the US. That would that would give the US a fighting chance to survive the onslaughts from warmer climate. And we're seeing how they're killing people even in the US, even in affluent areas of the US, on a fairly regular basis. I mean, the recent hurricanes being just one example, and everyone knows that there will be just more and more and more and more of this, and it will kill just more and more and more people and destroy more and more ecosystems. But what the US is actually doing, and in the Biden administration has been uh, showering the oil and gas industry in licenses at a far higher rate than what the Trump administration did. So it doesn't really matter, it seems, if the people at the helm are supposedly enlightened and rational Democrats. They just keep sending fuel to the fire, a little bit like they do in the Middle East. It's these are self-destructive dynamics that are out of control, and you can point at them and look. Governments shouldn't do this because it's not in anyone's rational long-term interest to behaving in this destructive manner. But no matter how much we point that out, it just goes on and it accelerates because rationality is as far from these things as it could be, I think.
But it also, I mean, on a level of analysis, it's also important in terms of what we deem to be a fruitful strategy or even a possible strategy to pursue. I mean, because some people might argue that, well, we should simply, as I said before, kind of make these green technologies profitable for the capitalist class, and then the transition might go about. But if the analysis is more focusing on types of asset stranding and these path dependencies you mentioned, then of course the strategy would have to be very different, and I don't know, maybe include what you just mentioned right now, the aspect of criminalization or something like that. So this is quite important still, I guess. The analysis important for the question of how to pursue or what we even perceive as possible routes to go. So you stated before that there are basically three options, or at least I understood it as if within a capitalist point of view, there are three options. I guess if you leave this perspective, there are maybe other options as well. But from a capitalist point of view, there are three options. You already mentioned them: adaptation, carbon dioxide removal, and geoengineering. And I'm interested in all of them. So let's maybe pick them apart a little bit and start with adaptation. Adaptation, of course, has multiple layers to it. And it's like in a very basic sense, an absolutely necessary feature of life. If we do not adapt to changing circumstances, we will at some point create problems and ultimately cease to exist, I would argue. But your argument is directed against a certain type of adaptation as an argument for business as usual, I guess. And it's directed against something you call muscular adaptation. So could you maybe tell us a little bit more about this notion of adaptation, what type of adaptation you want to see take place, and what type of adaptation you are criticizing, for example, through this notion of muscular adaptation?
Yeah, just first on a comment on these three things that you can do. I think when we're in this mess of unmitigated global warming, so a global warming that wasn't ever mitigated, these three options really fill out the menu, as in there isn't much else that you can do, whether you're a communist or a free market fanatic. It doesn't really matter, but these are the three main options available. And adaptation, as you say, is necessary precisely because it's gone so far and it's so late, and people are suffering around the world from the consequences of global warming. It's too late to make the argument that adaptation is a distraction, or adaptation is just an excuse to continue with business as usual. It can be that, but it can also be the difference between life and death for people on the front lines. So it's a luxury position that we have to abandon, not to engage with politics of adaptation. Now, I should say that our section on adaptation in the second book is by far the shortest. So we're essentially skimming the surface of this huge field, which is in a way indistinguishable from the field of human experiences of climate change as such. Because when you ask how do people adapt, well, that means how do people around the world cope with the impacts of global warming in their lives. And people struggle, and people have, intensifying experiences of impacts of climate change around the world. And most of the struggle that is happening is ad hoc, in the sense that people spontaneously just try to survive, try to get by, get along with the resources that they have. And this is why we say that adaptation is a run through the battlefield, because if you see these strikes from climate breakdown as, projectiles falling on a battlefield, what people do when they try to adapt is that they try to run through this battlefield and avoid being struck by the projectiles, and shield themselves with whatever resources they have for doing so. This is based on the fact that the term vulnerable or vulnerability comes from a Latin phrase, vulnerabilis, used for soldiers who were already lying wounded on the battlefield and therefore would easily succumb to another blow. And scholars of vulnerability to climate change have, kind of seized on this etymological origin of the word to make the point that people who are vulnerable to climate change tend to be those who already are wounded from various blows that they have received in unequal societies. So people who do not own any property, people who live from poorly paid work, women, various ethnic minorities subjected to discrimination tend to be much more vulnerable than others to the impacts of global warming. So, out of this then has developed the idea of transformative adaptation, which is the idea that to make people better equipped to run through this battlefield and survive, we need a fairer distribution of resources. So that, for instance, not just the rich, metaphorically or literally, have seawalls, but everyone has seawalls. Everyone has seawalls. That kind of thinking around adaptation, which is, of course, the most progressive and, in a way, promising approach to adaptation. That, okay, we are suffering a loss of resources. They are becoming more and more scarce, whether it's land to live on, or it's water to use for irrigation or drinking or whatever. And therefore, the way to deal with this and to cope is to change human relations so that these resources are fairly distributed when they become scarce and when people have to struggle to survive. However, this is not the approach to adaptation that is being practiced around the world. There's a lot of talk of it in certain scientific circles, but it doesn't really happen on the ground. What you see happening on the ground is it's just left to people to survive as private agents on a market, more or less. So the ethos for this kind of adaptation is like, okay, let them build seawalls, do what you can on this battlefield, and see if you can live. But there's also something else coming up, which we term muscular adaptationism, which is a kind of an ideology that says that the best way to deal with these impacts is to build large, fancy technological projects for minimizing the damage that they do. And a case that we spent just a little bit of time on is that of the huge water reservoirs or mega bassins being built in the French countryside to collect increasingly scarce water for agribusiness farms so that they can irrigate their fields. These projects have elicited significant discontent and protest in France because farmers not, privy to these projects, who do not own huge farms, tend to lose out when the water is extracted and concentrated into those pools. So you've had mass demonstrations and even very violent riots again around these projects. But muscular adaptationism, it can also be that when you have wildfires, you see presidents and others calling for more water bombers. So we're going to have better airplanes for bombing these fires out of existence. Or, which is now kind of the cutting edge of this muscular adaptationist way of thinking, instead of trying to combat sea level rise on coastlines around the world, we could build seawalls at the outlet of the glaciers on the polar ice sheets. So seawalls around Antarctica and Greenland, or where the major glaciers are, and have their outlets into the ocean. This is kind of shading into geoengineering, but our argument is that one of the arguments that we have is that this focus on huge technological projects for dealing with the impacts and adapting to them create their own kinds of problems, and tend to be very, very weak defenses against global warming if it continues. There's no way that you can save yourself by water bombing wildfires if these wildfires keep growing and becoming more destructive and more frequent the way they are now, to take just one example. Yeah, that was a long-winded answer.
No, totally fine. So you already mentioned like one aspect of an alternative form of adaptation, transformative adaptation, you called it. What would you say is the role of the concept of adaptation for left politics? Would you say that there is a prominent role for this notion of adaptation within left politics, in the sense of maybe being a guiding principle that follows the modernist notion of progress? Because the question of progress, of course, is not untainted, I would say. So there are scholars, I'm thinking of Philipp Stab, a German sociologist, who wrote a book about Anpassung als Leitprinzip der kommenden Gesellschaft, so adaptation as a leitmotif of the coming society. So he argues basically that adaptation kind of succeeds this notion of progress, of modernist progress. And I'm wondering if you would see adaptation in such a prominent role as well when it comes to left politics and the larger project that the left should pursue.
Yeah, I mean, of course, you can approach the concept or category of adaptation from a much broader perspective. I mean, adaptation in Adorno, for instance, is a negative term mostly. I mean, it has a bad name because it signifies people adapting to society, to the dominant order, and basically, resigning themselves to the way that things are. So adaptation as the opposite of any kind of, transformational or ruptural or even revolutionary activity. In that sense, adaptation has a bad name in left politics, and rightly so. But what we're dealing with here is a much more concrete problem, which is how do people in their actual lives cope with the blows that they receive from global warming? And there's no way that we can shy away from that or look the other side just because we on the left traditionally don't like the notion of adaptation. Because what we're dealing with here is, I mean, what are the indigenous peoples in the Amazon going to do when the rainforest is drying out as it is right now? I mean, the drought and the heat in the Amazon have been absolutely horrendous over the past months. Or what are the pastoralists in Somalia going to do when they can't find water for their livestock? Another very urgent problem. Most of this is going on in the global south, and it's beneath the radar of what reaches Western media most of the time. But this is a question already of life and death for masses of people in the global south. And of course, it's coming our way too. But this is something that we will have to take very, very seriously, precisely because we're in a moment where global warming is now striking with full force because it was never dealt with. It was never dealt with by the dominant classes. The only thing that came out of these decades of climate negotiations and talk and offsets and everything is just continued emissions and continued extraction and continued investment in oil and gas and coal. So yeah, the left needs to engage with the problem of adaptation. And to go back to the French case, that is unique in that we have in the global north for the first time a very significant mass-based and militant climate movement that has taken on the issue of adaptation and fought this battle against these mega basin that really are not a solution to the problem of the French countryside drying out, but rather making that problem worse. And I think we will see more of this kind of climate politics from movements in the years ahead.
All right. The second option that you address is this question of carbon dioxide removal. And I think it was a really nuanced view that you take there, because, I mean, you already hinted towards the fact that we need to remove carbon dioxide. So that's basically a fact. And that also means that we will have to engage with the question of how this needs to be structured in order to not kind of create new problems, but actually address the problems we have effectively. So what is it about carbon dioxide removal? What are the options we have? What are the ways in which it's being used right now or being proposed within a capitalist context? And what would alternative ways of using it look like?
Yeah, so here we're in the moment of creativity in the sense that people are throwing out so many different ideas for how CO2 can be removed. Some of them are just totally nutty and crazy, and others seem quite promising. The first, and in a sense, the original carbon dioxide removal technology was and is bioenergy carbon capture and storage. So the idea that you establish plantations of fast-growing trees, eucalyptus or a hybrid polar or something like that, and they capture CO2 naturally through photosynthesis. And then when they have reached a certain maturity, you cut them down, you harvest these trees, you take them to a power plant and you burn them as biomass in this plant to generate electricity, much as if you would burn coal or gas. But then you have a kind of a filter. It's most easy to think of it as a filter that captures the CO2 molecules in the column of smoke, you could say. And with this filter, you get a pure concentrated stream of CO2 that you can then inject into the ground. And if you repeat the cycle, you replant the trees that you've harvested and you let them naturally suck down CO2 and so on and so forth. You produce a pump for drawing CO2 out of the atmosphere. This is the idea of BECCS, bioenergy carbon capture and storage. And it was with BECCS that the idea developed that we can have overshoot and return, so we can miss the 1.5 degree limit, let emissions go above, and then because towards the end of this century, we are going to roll out these massive BECCS plantations, we can take the CO2 back down and pump it under the ground. This whole technology has more or less been revealed to be complete farce. I mean, it's bizarre how BECCS was allowed to play that role uh, as a carte blanche for just continued business as usual on the presumption that this technology would materialize towards the end of this century, when the technology at that point actually didn't exist in any more than one location, which is a place in Illinois. And my colleague Wim, he sent me this note yesterday about this particular plant. I quote, over in Illinois, the first large-scale industrial carbon capture and storage facility in the US is reportedly leaking. Archer Daniels Midland has paused operations at the site in Decatur after signs of a potential brine fluid leak were detected at the end of September. Some locals are worried that the facility could threaten drinking water. So the world had exactly one operational Bex plantation that would, and this being the technology that would shoulder this task of taking the CO2 out that has been, put into the atmosphere and propelled us above 1.5. And now that facility is down because apparently it's guilty of spreading toxic pollutants around its neighborhood. There are other Beck's projects in the pipeline, but Beck's really is an object lesson in the insanity of banking on unproven negative emissions technologies and justify and use them to justify continued business as usual. And of course, Bex, if you look into it as a technology, were it ever to materialize, would create the most mind-boggling effects on ecosystems and people. Uh, Various estimates suggest that if Bex were to accomplish the task assigned to it in these various climate models and IPCC scenarios, something like the equivalent of all currently used cropland would have to be devoted to these plantations. Because if you're going to reach that kind of scale, you need absolutely astronomical amounts of land for these trees to take down the CO2. Where's that land going to come from? So the Beck's discussion has been bogged down in this totally unsolvable dilemma of where are we going to get the land for Beck's plantations from. I mean, the only proposal that has some credibility to it is that we make most of humanity go vegan and we give over the livestock plantations to Beck's. Uh, Me personally, I find that idea quite acceptable, although I'm not unfortunately myself not vegan, but I think it makes sense. But if you were to do that, you would encounter a lot of resistance too, because not everyone wants to go vegan. Uh, so this is just to say that all negative emissions technologies come with their own different problems, and Bex is maybe the paradigmatic case. But because the problems of Bex are so conspicuous, much of the attention has shifted recently towards direct air capture, which I could talk about for a long time because it's at the center of much of what we're writing. But just to say that I mean, we use the word catalog. You can, it's like browsing through a catalog or going through some kind of a business fair or something. There are all of these startups and research groups that are throwing out ideas for carbon dioxide removal all the time. So there's no shortage of ideas, and new are coming really, really almost every day, it seems like.
But is there a promising one? I mean, that would be interesting still. I mean, if you say Bex is kind of out of the picture, but as far as I understood it, direct air capture is something that you argue we should consider, then what would be the mechanism through which direct air capture can be done in a sensible way?
Yeah. Yeah, so direct air capture works very differently. It is essentially a machine for blowing in air through a filter, again, that selectively captures the CO2 molecules in the air. And this machine doesn't require any particular kind of land devoted to it because it's not based on photosynthesis. So it doesn't require fields for growing stuff. It's just one more mechanical contraption that you can, in principle, put anywhere. And that's one of the great advantages of DAC, that it doesn't have that space requirement that Bex does. What it does require is energy, electricity, and heat in huge quantities, because to get hold of these CO2 molecules that are still very thinly spread in the air, you need a lot of electricity to power the machines, and you need heat to process the filter in which the CO2 ends up and generate the pure stream of CO2. So that on a massive scale would consume, again, mind-boggling amounts, not of land, but of electricity and heat. And would then necessarily have to compete with other use of electricity and heat. So some would argue that we shouldn't even consider DAC until we have scaled up the renewable energy sector so much that it can replace all of fossil fuels. The first thing we need to do, obviously, is to stop burning fossil fuels, which means that we should devote all renewable energy capacity to that purpose, not to building DAC plants for taking CO2 out of the air while we are still pumping far more CO2 into the air by burning fossil fuel. And I think that's a very convincing argument. But you could say that there are places around the world where the installation of solar and wind capacity is such that you have local gluts of electricity from solar and wind. You have surpluses because very often when you have big wind and solar installations on a sunny day or a windy day, you have too much electricity on your hands. This is one reason why prices tend to get depressed if you have solar and wind dominating energy production. But that kind of glut, that extra, almost often wasted electricity from solar and wind would be perfect for powering DAC plants, because then they wouldn't compete with the energy used to displace fossil fuels. So that's, I think, is a quite reasonable idea to think that we could plan DAC in such a fashion that we put the DAC machines in places where there already is so much renewable energy that there is more than we need. And this isn't very difficult to reach that point because the world is blessed with an abundance of solar and wind in quite a few places. Now, that's one aspect. Another very significant aspect is that DAC, as it is being developed around the world right now, and it's much, much more developed than BECCS, tends to produce then pure streams of CO2 that can be used for two things. Either you bundle this CO2 up as a kind of commodity and you sell it to a consumer, and as a owner of a DAC plant and a producer of CO2, you can then easily make money. Or you bundle the CO2 up and you shoot it down into the ground and you turn it into dead stone. This is often known as mineralization of CO2. And you never see the CO2 again. It's not used for anything. It's just buried. And when you do that, that's when you actually remove CO2 from the atmosphere. This happens in only one place on Earth so far. That's Iceland. In all other cases, what DAC companies do is they capture CO2 and then they want to make money from it. So they sell the CO2 as fizzed Coca-Cola, for instance. And if you sell CO2 as fizzed Coca-Cola, that means it's back in the atmosphere as soon as the consumer of the Coca-Cola bottle burps. Or you sell the CO2, and this is by far the most important market for CO2, to oil companies who use it for what's known as enhanced oil recovery. So they take this concentrated CO2 and inject it into the ground to increase the pressure under the oil in old fields, and get hold of this oil that is otherwise very difficult to extract. So enhanced oil recovery by means of CO2 captured through DAC is a process for taking out even more oil of the reserves. And this is the main market for commodified CO2 from DAC and other negative emissions technologies around the world, primarily in the US, which means that a technology that was supposed to help us to reduce the concentration of CO2 is actually on the ground used to help oil and gas companies, oil in particular, take out even more oil out of the ground. This is how perverse the capitalist mode of production is. And then our argument is that, okay, if we actually want to realize what seems to be the promise of DAC here, namely to take CO2 out of the atmosphere, what we need to do first, obviously, is to stop pouring new CO2 into the atmosphere. This means shutting down the entire fossil fuel industry. But then we also need to make sure that the DAC industry doesn't fall under the compulsion of producing commodities and making profit. Because there is no way that you can produce commodities or make profit out of the work of cleaning up the atmosphere and putting the CO2 back under the ground in the form of stone. No one can sell that as a commodity, as an input to other companies, because it is by definition something not to be used. And this is the contradiction that mineralization constantly runs into. Companies would say, where are we going to make profit from just burying the CO2 and never seeing it again? It seems by definition impossible. This would be an exercise in public waste management, where the atmosphere would be treated as a common good that we would need to clean up by companies that would need to be publicly owned and funded and not expected to turn a profit for putting the CO2 back down into the ground. So DAC is a very intriguing and fascinating technology, and it's complex, and it's a lot about who gets to develop DAC for what purposes, and how could we use DAC differently, and what are the possibilities and limitations for doing that.
Very, very interesting, I have to say. And I mean, I think one can see the promise as you just sketched it. One can also see like the capitalist class arguing, well, if we have duck, let's just continue, you know?
Sure. And that is what they are saying.
Yeah.
That's what the original ideologists of DAC said, Klaus Lackner and others, that the great thing about DAC is that then we can have the coal industry forever.
Yeah.
And Saudi Aramco and other oil companies in the Gulf are, warming up to DAC precisely because it allows them to say that we can have a circular carbon economy, so we can continue spewing out CO2, and then we'll have these machines for taking them back.
Mm-hmm.
The problem here, as with all of these things, is that DAC cannot do this because every negative emissions technology, including DAC, is constrained by physical limits. So if you keep pumping CO2 in the atmosphere, I mean, we're currently putting out 40 gigatons of CO2 in the atmosphere from the world economy every year. If we keep doing that and we increase this maybe to 50 gigaton, to 60 gigaton, there will be so much CO2 in the atmosphere that DAC would have to claim, I don't know, maybe the equivalent of all currently used electricity and heat on Earth for taking all of that down. Yeah, the more CO2 that is being put into the atmosphere, the more extreme the challenge for a negative emissions technology like DAC. The only way that a negative emissions technology like DAC can fulfill its task is to keep that task limited. Already now there's so much CO2 in the atmosphere that a DAC infrastructure for taking all of that down would need to be absolutely enormous. The best way for DAC would have been if we had stopped at emissions levels maybe in the 1970s or 80s or 90s and capped, zero emissions from that point, and then you could have built DAC plantations, DAC plants for taking down what was out. But the more CO2 that is being put into the atmosphere, the harder it becomes for any technology to remove the CO2. And this very much goes for DAC. And it's not just a matter of energy. It's not just a matter of electricity and heat. It's a matter of, okay, you can't build an infinite amount of DAC plants because they need steel and other kinds of material. And ultimately, of course, they need land to stand on. So the idea that we can have DAC to continuously, infinitely uh, return ongoing emissions from business as usual has no scientific credibility.
Right. And I mean, I guess that's also the reason why when we started this passage of our conversation, where I said, from a capitalist point of view,
Yes, exactly,
there are these three
yes,
options.
yes.
But now you already folded it in all of your answers that the first thing we need to do is, of course, to stop burning fossil fuel and stop
Yes,
kind
yes,
of
yes,
and reduce the emissions. So that's, of course,
yes.
like the fourth option, which is like non-negotiable, which is why I guess you didn't have it in the three-part argument. So we have adaptation, we have carbon dioxide removal, and the third option that is on the table, but we will see how you think about it. The third option that is on the table of the capitalist class, at least, is called geoengineering. I always thought that carbon dioxide removal would be a subcategory of geoengineering, but you argue that maybe because you distinguish how useful these technologies might be, you distinguish between the two. So what is geoengineering about? What kind of technologies are being proposed, and what do you think about it?
Yeah, no, you're right that carbon dioxide removal and solar radiation management were often bundled together and referred to as geoengineering in the literature until recently. It's like over the past 10 years or so that there's been generally a tend to analytically separate them because they do different things. Carbon dioxide removal is about taking CO2 out of the atmosphere. Solar radiation management, which has now become synonymous with solar geoengineering or just geoengineering, doesn't care about CO2. It does something completely different, which is to try to reduce the heat that enters the climate system by intercepting solar radiation or insolation. Not all of it, obviously, but some. So the idea is we block some of the incoming sunlight, and therefore the Earth gets cooler. And again, here, there are a lot of different ideas for how to do this. But the most popular idea by far, and the one that seems most realistic, is to fill modified airplanes with aerosols from sulfate and shoot them up in the stratosphere and have them inject these sulfate aerosols in the stratosphere so that they form a kind of a sunshade that blocks sunlight. On the model of what volcanoes have done, more spectacularly, what the asteroid did when it struck the Earth 65 million years ago and killed the dinosaurs. But this, or what atomic bombs would do in a nuclear winter scenario. But I mean, the basic mechanisms of how this would work are relatively well known. If you have this kind of uh, cloud of perpetually injected sulfate aerosols high in the stratosphere, you would actually block a fraction of incoming sunlight, and it's up to you to decide how much by adjusting the doses. And this would affect a drop in average temperature on Earth, and the drop would be fast compared to every other option on the table, very fast. There is no other technology that has the capacity to slash average temperature on Earth virtually from one day to the next, or more practically, perhaps 1 month or 1 year to the next. You could potentially have a very significant cut in average temperature on Earth by doing this. That you will never get from direct air capture or BECCS or any other negative emissions technology, because it would by definition take a long time for them to draw down CO2 and thereby alter climatic conditions on Earth. And you wouldn't get it um, from mitigation either. It's only solar geoengineering that has this potential to, rapidly cool the Earth. And this is why there is a kind of a structural imperative pushing in its direction, or why it has such a magnetic pull, because since global warming is out of control, temperatures are rising all the time. We seem to be heading potentially towards a moment where some Policymakers high up in the global hierarchy freak out and say, oh, we have to get this thing quickly under control, a little bit like early in the pandemic. We have to roll out some technology that cuts temperatures immediately because now it's too late and we're about to completely burn. What do we do? Yeah, the only thing you can do in such a situation is to send out these planes. This is the basic rationale, the basic logic of solar geoengineering.
And I mean, in the case of ducks, you kind of sketched a scenario in which there would be a possible use that you kind of see as a sensible aspect of different types of technologies that we should use. In the case of geoengineering, you don't see any such case. Is that right?
Yeah. Yes. I mean, so we have a little phrase in the beginning of the second volume where we talk about concrete analysis of the concrete technology. This is a riff on a phrase from Lenin, who spoke about the need to have concrete analysis of a concrete situation or concrete conjuncture. And what we mean by this is that when we study these kinds of technologies on offer, we should be empirical and open and nuanced and not depart from a position of ideological prejudice, as in we are for all modern technology. This is the kind of modernist, boosterist, Promethean program. You can find this from something like the Breakthrough Institute, although they're quite hostile to renewable energy. So maybe, yeah, but you know what I mean. People who just generally love fancy modern tech. That's a very common attitude in our society. Another attitude that you can find on the fringes of the environmental left is a sort of principled resistance against all modern technology, denouncing them as all part of the problem by definition, just by being advanced forms of technology. And I think that's an unhelpful attitude too, and that we need to be, specific when we analyze different technologies. For me, myself, this has led to diverging trajectories. So the more I read about solar power, for instance, the more optimistic I get about its technological utilities and capacities. Uh, as for solar geoengineering, I, at a certain point, some years back, was maybe a little bit attracted by the idea that you can use potentially solar geoengineering for progressive purposes. But I have concluded, the more I've read and the more I've learned about this technology, that it is an inherently extremely dangerous technology. And I find it very, very difficult to have any kind of support for it, or any kind of idea that this can be used for good progressive purposes. And I think that comrades on the left who make that case are on the verge of spreading dangerous illusions. And I don't see any situation where we should advocate solar geoengineering. But to make that convincing, of course, we would have to go into all the potentially catastrophic side effects of solar geoengineering. Ultimately, the risk of the termination shock, and how solar geoengineering really does seem to require centralized, militarized control over the planet as a whole for the technology to even function, to work out. That said, I can still envision situations in the future where global warming has become so bad that when someone, and that someone is likely still to be Pentagon, says that, okay, now we're going to do solar geoengineering, that you, as much as you hate it, would potentially have to temporarily suspend your hostility to that technology and not, try to attack it with sabotage or shoot down the planes or something like that. But if that were to happen, as soon as geoengineering gets going, the one demand has to be to stop it. Because there's nothing more dangerous than keeping solar geoengineering going decade after decade, decade after decade, even century after century, because that will inevitably, just continuous geoengineering will produce these side effects and quite likely ultimately the termination shock. So, we have this phrase: if everyone loves geoengineering, then everyone will die. It's that kind of technology that really needs to be resisted and taken. If it ever happens, the goal must be to discontinue it as fast as physically possible. Yeah.
Okay, so we now have a better idea of a certain type of tool set that you propose, things that should be pursued, others that we should not pursue or fight against even heavily. Let's maybe transition into another topic that is kind of a follow-up to this question of which types of routes should be pursued and which not. And this topic would be the question of planning, and more specifically forms of democratic planning. There are multiple nods in the direction of planning as an basically essential element of the fight against climate breakdown. You quote the IPCC urging for, and I quote, systems of transitions of an unprecedented scale, and end quote, and that these could only come about through more planning and stronger institutions. You write that the panel also calls for, quote, effective planning in cities and, quote, coordinated planning of agricultural sectors and a shift in investment patterns. So there is planning on the table, of course. You at some point also argue for a people's commissariat for removal, I think, and it's kind of a nice picture, I think. What do you think about democratic planning as a also narrative of an alternative? And what do you imagine a democratic ecological planned economy would look like?
Mm. Yeah, this is a very big question, and it cuts at the heart of the matter, obviously. I can just say that we had planned to have a discussion around planning towards the end of the second volume, but towards the end of it, we were so tired, and the book had already become so large that we decided to omit that and maybe save it for later. Thankfully, there are a lot of people working on these issues. You yourself, there are comrades like Cédric Durand and others in France who work a lot on ecological planning. Um, yeah, so I'm not the best informed, or I'm not the person who's thought most thoroughly and consistently about this recently. But let me just say that uh, uh, planning seems absolutely crucial and inherent to everything here if it's going to succeed. So radical, rapid emissions cuts obviously would require an enormous amount of planning. States would have to intervene to transform their economies in no time. And this can only be done through planning. It could perhaps be done through some more, gentle nudging and a bit of market mechanisms if it had begun 3 decades ago. But because the task has been left so late and just postponed and postponed, the challenge of emissions reductions is now so large that it can only be accomplished by states through very intrusive planning, comprehensive planning of economies. Whether that planning will be democratic or not is, of course, an open question. But you could clearly make the case that, for instance, nationalizing the fossil fuel companies and forcing them to either invest in renewable energy or turning them into public utilities for carbon dioxide removal would be, by definition, an extension of democracy, because now these entities operate outside of all kind of democratic control, and they just by dint of owning a lot of private capital have the de facto right to destroy the planet with no popular say, no democratic mandate or oversight. So it would be a deepening of democracy if energy production was, encompassed under public democratic control. Then you could say that this scenario is what has terrified fossil capital in particular and the capitalist classes in general ever since the climate question emerged. They have done everything they could to make sure that this doesn't happen, that their private companies remain private and remain free of regulation, let alone public ownership, and that they can just continue to do their business as they like. And scholars that have a deep loyalty to the capitalist order, people like David Keith, for instance, the chief ideologist of solar geoengineering, they would, I mean, they have taken on the task of developing these alternatives to mitigation, largely because they don't want to see that kind of break with capitalism, that kind of state intervention and planning. So you can understand negative emissions technologies and solar geoengineering, and to an extent adaptation as well, as the bourgeois alternatives to planning of the energy economy. Now, the irony, the great irony here, is that for these alternatives to work, you will also need a lot of planning. And solar geoengineering here is perhaps the clearest case. And David Keith himself is very explicit about this, that for solar geoengineering to work, you have to have a very centralized control over it. Because it's not going to work if you have a lot of different agents doing geoengineering at the same time, in their, expressing their own preferences by trying to influence the stratosphere as they like. That would be a recipe for total chaos and breakdown of the technology. The only way that solar geoengineering can work is that there is one agent, one institution that plans and modifies all of the climate of the Earth. This is a much more extreme form of planning than anything that has been proposed when it comes to mitigation. And what it most likely translates into would be that you would have Pentagon planning the planet for whatever preferences it has, because the military apparatus of the United States is by far the likeliest candidate for actually deploying sulfate aerosol injection. So, and it's the same for, okay, if you're going to do BECCS on a massive, massive scale, you will again need planning encompassing the Earth as a whole. Where are you going to locate these plantations? How are you going to transport the biomass to the power plants where you're going to burn it? Who's going to account for the credits? All of these things, it's just one more Pandora's box of variables that would have to be encompassed in a machine for planning. The same with DAC, the same with every kind of negative emissions technology. If you want to do something on that scale, you have to plan. So the irony here is that by inventing all of these substitutes for the original planning of the economy that was so distasteful to the ruling classes and their intellectuals, you end up with a situation where you have to plan not just the economy, but a lot of other additional economies. So the economy for drawing down CO2 and the economy for blocking incoming sunlight. So there seems to be no escape from planning, and every attempt to escape from planning just ends up with the necessity of planning things even more. And someone like David Keith, of course, is aware that ultimately, if you do solar geoengineering without mitigation, that means utter apocalypse. The only way that solar geoengineering can work is that if it's combined with conclusive phasing out of fossil fuels. That's unlikely to happen, but conceptually, everyone knows that if you keep pumping CO2 in the atmosphere while doing solar geoengineering to mask the effects, you will have worse and worse side effects, and you will very likely eventually have the termination shock, and boom, you will have the radiative forcing of the CO2 accumulated in the atmosphere activated, and you will roast the Earth. So for a scheme like Keith's to work, you would actually you would have a plan, need to have a planned geoengineering, but it would have to come on top of planned mitigation. So every escape from planning ends up with the need for just more of it. Which means that obviously it would have been much better to just take over the private capitalist anarchic economy and subject it to democratic planning in the first place, because then you wouldn't have to do solar geoengineering or BECS.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess two things. I mean, the first one would be, I think you rightly pointed it out. It's not really the question of whether planning yes or no, but planning in the interest of whom, and
Yes.
planning democratic planning or kind of non-democratic planning. And then the second aspect would be, what I'm asking myself is, I think you really nicely show within Overshoot how there was an incentive kind of not to pursue this transformation. There was an incentive not only on the side of fossil capital, but they were obviously in cahoots with nation states who kind of served as a vehicle through which this fighting off transformation, or this insisting on the path dependencies and so on, how this got assured for fossil capital in order not to lose their investment, and in order not to bring about kind of capital stranding, asset stranding in an unprecedented scale. So nation states have been a crucial element through which Overshoot was made to come about. So
True.
why then, or I mean, I understand it in terms of scale, why you argue that nation states would have to be the actor, the agent through which democratic planning would come about. I understand it because they are on the level of scale, the actor which obviously is the first one to think about, but empirical evidence, so to speak, speaks against it, in the sense that they were those who kind of were intrinsically linked to fossil capital, making sure that overshoot is happening. So that would beg the question, if we think about alternatives to the status quo, if we want democratic planning, why think again, I have to underscore again, that states would be the actor to ally with in order to make this transformation come about?
Yeah, so I think precisely the question of democracy and scale provides the, it's democracy and scale that provide the answer to this question. So you can think of a state that has been totally aligned with fossil capital, and even with primitive fossil capital. It was the term we use for the fossil fuel industry for decades. You can imagine this state being taken over by a different kind of political force through a democratic election. And this new government deciding that we're going to break this symbiosis with primitive fossil capital in which we have lived for decades and actually shut it down. And there is one country in the world of significance that where we can see precisely such a dynamic happening right now, and that is in Colombia. Colombia is the only fossil fuel producing nation of significance that has signed up to the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. It is the only such producer that now has as an explicit policy to phase out the fossil fuel industry from the entire body of its national economy. And this is because Colombia has, for the first time, a progressive left-wing government with Gustavo Petro as the president, and the very energetic and important Minister of the Environment, Susanna Mohammed. And they are now spearheading a unique transitional project. And Colombia, we should remember, is the third largest fossil fuel producer in Latin America after Brazil and Venezuela. And it has been entirely dependent for its revenues on export of oil and coal. And now the the public intention in that government is to just end this. And just the other day, Bloomberg wrote about how the Latin American nation has halted new exploration of oil and gas. And now it wants developed countries and multilateral development banks to help it move away from fossil fuels. So Mohammed and Peter, they're planning a $40 billion transition plan, and fundamentally restructure the economy of Colombia, which of course suffers its own impacts from climate change with wildfires and drought and all these things. This is exactly the kind of project that we need. Now, it's almost too good to be true. And obviously they're facing fight back from bourgeoisies, local and global. And who knows what kind of reactionary attacks they will face in the near future. But this shows that it can be done. You can actually democratically seize the state apparatus, win it through elections. And of course, that electoral victory was rooted in the revolt that happened in Colombia in 2019. That included a lot of mass action and confrontation with police, but like a groundswell of the popular uprising that was then converted into a democratic mandate to do this. And this is a textbook example of what a state can do. And I think it shows quite clearly that it's actually only the state that can do it. It would be very difficult to see the student collectives that were on the front lines fighting the cops in 2019 making these decisions to shut down the Colombian fossil fuel industry. That kind of decision has to be taken at a government level, but that government has to have organic roots to the popular movements that have put them where they are via election. Now, in the global north, that's where you should see this happen, because it's much easier for economies in the global north that have large fossil fuel industries to transition away from them, because they have much more diversified economies. So a country like the US or Canada or Norway could much easier do without the revenues from oil and gas than a country like Colombia, which is, by comparison, very poor. You don't see any kind of initiatives like this in the global north. It happens in southern countries run by progressive leaders. There are similar cases in other Latin American countries, although none as advanced as in Colombia. But the country in the global north where you can, envision the contours of a dynamic like this would be France. Because in France, you have a left that has a proven capacity to win national elections. It just did so. It was robbed of that electoral victory by Emmanuel Macron because of the insanely anti-democratic presidential system they have in that country. But the core of the Nouveau Front Populaire is La France Insoumise, which has a very good organic relation with popular movements, including Soulèvement de la Terre, this climate movement that has struggled against the mega bassins. And in France, unlike in Germany or in Sweden or in Britain after Corbyn, you can at least, see it as a not entirely unplausible scenario that you would have a left winning the democratic elections, even the presidential election, and in relation to popular movements active on the ground, initiating a transition, which would in that country primarily mean taking down Total, which is the single largest private company headquartered in France, the equivalent of the fossil fuel industry in Colombia. That would be democratic planning, and I think that's why I think the comrades, intellectuals in France are at the front line of thinking about these things around democratic planning. Yeah.
So I think we have fully transitioned into the next aspect of our conversation that I would like to explore a little bit more, and that is the narrative aspect that follows your analysis. Because at least for me, when reading the book or the books, it seemed as if you, on the one hand, try to analyze the situation in a very sober way when it comes to which technologies do we have, what are the reasons of the capital side for not pursuing transformations and so on. We touched upon these questions. But it seemed to me as if you're also trying to develop an idea of where the climate movement is at narrative-wise. Like there was this 1.5 marker. This has been transgressed, so this is obviously a huge loss, and this can't be denied. The second book is called Climate Politics When It's Too Late. So there is already this notion of being too late, certain type of defeatism as well, I would say, included in this title. So you kind of have a certain narrative aspect in these books as well when it comes to not only getting a new notion of the climate movement and its politics in the present, but also, I would say, when it comes to a certain type of imaginary of the future. So I'm interested in this constellation because I kind of stumbled over this too late, I have to say, because it's, of course, like factually right that we are too late to not transgress 1.5. That's absolutely true. But also, I mean, as I said, it kind of instills a notion of defeatism into the heart of the narrative. And I think you have to also ask, okay, well, too late for what? Definitely, we are not too late for trying to aim for democratic planning on a unprecedented scale. So there is a type of renegotiation to be had within the climate movement, I guess. Not only because 1.5 is being transgressed, because we are in this specific historical situation, but also when it comes to kind of developing a positive notion, a positive imaginary of what might be and how we could get there. Is this something that you engage with? Because you have a very prominent position within the climate movement. Also, when it comes to this level of building a narrative of not only a narrative, but also a self-reflection of the movement's actions in relation to the outcome, and then attached to this question of narrative and imaginary of the future. So it's interesting for me to hear your thoughts about these elements that need to be addressed for sure, I guess, also in order not to kind of lose hope and energy and movement, so to speak.
Yeah, no, these are crucial questions. And I think people who have been in the climate movement for some time are struggling with these questions a lot. I'm restricting myself here to Europe, but I think like comrades in the UK who have been in the movement for many years, but perhaps even more so comrades in Germany, are thinking a lot about this because there is a general sense of defeat. At least that's what I get from comrades in Germany. Primarily the people in Ende Gelände, which was for me like the big source of movement hope between 2015 and 22, let's say. And my very good friend Tajo Miller, who is kind of the leading organic intellectual of Ende Gelände, he has really tried to develop a new way of thinking about these things recently. And he's talking about just collapse and yeah, I mean, it's more like within the framework of adaptation, like how can we ensure that collapse to him seems inevitable now, but we need to collapse together and make something livable out of it, and it's something empowering, and try to intervene in these moments of crisis that are on our way. Something like that. But I mean, if you're interested in this, you should read his writings directly. What we do in this book is, in a way, a little bit similar, and with this idea of the climate politics when it's too late. The argument that we make, although it's spread out over hundreds of pages in this second book, is that climate politics when it's too late means that it's now too late to avoid warming of the amount that was defined as dangerous, because we're already in 1.5 degree territory. This means not that there is less to do for the climate movement, but much more to do, because it means that we will have to intervene on these
multiplying fronts, these other fronts as well. Adaptation, carbon dioxide removal, and geoengineering. The very fact that it's too late means that there will be inevitably more climate politics because all of these new fronts will be opened up. And that's, I think, why the second book begins with the Battle of Saint-Souline and the struggle of Soulèvement de la Terre, which is the first significant case of a climate movement in the global north, shifting its focus to adaptation. But what we, of course, also argue, and this is in a sense a facile argument, it's very predictable, is that none of these fronts, not we will be able we won't be able to make any kind of real progress on these fronts and score gains unless we return to the original front and accomplish the unaccomplished mission of mitigation, which is that it's to take the case of the water reservoirs. It would be pointless if we had perfectly fair distribution of scarce water in the French countryside where all farmers get as much water as they need. If this countryside just keeps drying out and you have worse and worse wildfires because the temperatures just rise and rise and rise and rise. Or to take a case from the global south that we write about a fair bit, in Egypt, people try to protect farmers try to protect their land from increasing salinity when the sea is pushing into their fields by elevating them with sand. And you could imagine a situation where all farmers had sand rather than a situation that is now, where it's only the rich farmers who can pour all the sand and the fertilizers and the irrigation water and all the input needed to elevate their lands above the rising salty water table. So you can have some kind of a communism of sand where everyone shares the sand and everything else needed. But if the seas just continue to rise, that's going to drown as well. It's going to be pointless. So none of these transformational adaptation projects can, in the long or even medium term, work unless you win the original battle of mitigation. So the fact that it's too late means that the climate movement needs to do more. There's more need for it. It has to intervene on all these other fronts, the secondary fronts. But any such intervention will be futile in the end if it doesn't find a way to win the battle on the original front of mitigation. So, kind of strategic question to think about is how do these other kinds of struggles around adaptation and these other things relate to the original one of fighting fossil capital and big oil and gas companies in particular. I don't know if this can be packaged as like one catchy narrative to empower people. I'm not sure because also what we're doing in this book is we're trying to map a kind of an emerging landscape of political front lines. And much of this is speculative, and we don't know what's going to happen in the next few years. And I mean, right now, climate politics really is on the back burner because, including in movement circles, in activist groups, since October 7 in particular, because so much of the movement energy that exists in a country like the US or the UK or France, I don't know about Germany, this is kind of an outlier case, is going into solidarity with Palestine. And now that the war is just completely about to, you know, unleash uncontrollable spirals, who knows how much political energy will be invested in the climate struggles over the next year or two. I mean, it's very difficult to say. So this book project maybe isn't really able to come up with catchphrases and easy slogans or programs for the movement. It's more like an attempt to stimulate conversation and thinking about, okay, what are the new emerging fronts for our politics, and hopefully people in the movement will find some of this useful.
Andreas, it's of course a very difficult question to end with, given all the things you just pointed out in your last answer. But at the end, I always ask, if you think about the future, what makes you joyful?
My kids in the external future. Well, I mean, when you read about climate, I would say that the only sector that can make you feel a little bit of cheer joy is perhaps not the right word, but feel a little bit cheerful at least. It's about the development of renewable energy technologies. How much you can do with solar and wind in a creative and smart way, and how you can make these energy sources available to poor people around the world, and how what has long been perceived as their drawbacks, their consumption of land and their intermittency and stuff like that, how these technical problems are being overcome in various ways. They're not without their problems, obviously, when it comes to materials consumption and extraction and things like that. But it's the only field of climate politics and science where good things happen. Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much, Andreas, for this conversation.
Thank you.
That was our show for today. Thanks a lot for listening. If you want to support Future Histories, you can do so on Patreon. For this, visit patreon.com/futurehistories, or you can simply tell a friend that you liked the show and that he, she, or they might like it as well. Thanks a lot, and hear you in 2 weeks.